Hey runners, welcome back. I want to show you how to use a lactate meter from the point of a PhD sports scientist. I've used one of these things for years and they've boomed in popularity over the last few, and I've seen a lot of incorrect advice from both athletes and coaches. So I want to show you how you can first off generate your lactate curve with a lactate threshold stepwise test, then how you can take the data from this curve to determine your maximal lactate steady state, test that and take the numbers from that maximal lactate steady state test out into your training for marathon and half marathon. I'll share with you my data, my training test sessions for marathon and half marathon, and how you can hopefully get numbers that correlate to this curve along with your half marathon and marathon and other event distances. Then I'll show you just some best practices for using one of these things so you can get the best readings possible. All right, let's get into it. So what I've done is I've rigged up a bit of a system here so you can see what I'm doing. What I want you to do initially when you have your lactate meter is do a lactate threshold test. So that's going to make you a graph that looks something like this, where we have pace and power on the x-axis, and on the y-axis we have our lactate concentration. So from here we can then identify two key points of our lactate curve. That's what this thing's called. So initially we're going to start off probably around zone 2. So the normal aerobic pace that you would be going if you were kind of running a steady run, right? Hopefully you've got some kind of threshold or training zone system already set up, but you want to be doing a steady run. And from there, you want to progress onto, let's say, the bottom of marathon pace. So if we call that lower marathon pace to upper marathon pace, and then we're going to get into something that would be around half marathon pace. Then we'd go 10K pace, and then we would go, say, 5K pace. There's a very crude example of what we'd be looking for, but what we want to initially do, if you have your own lactate meter, you can afford to do a bunch of these tests. Sorry, there it is. And we don't need to be too specific when we first get into it. If you're going out and you're doing a test with someone else, then you do want to be a bit more accurate. And what I'd be looking for is trying to find no more than 10 seconds per K range, or say 10 watts if you're using power, so 10 watts difference between your steps, because it's through this section here where we're going to get the most valuable data in terms of what is going to be a steady state for you and what is then going to be your true anaerobic threshold and the point of diminishing returns, which would be somewhere around here. So how do we do one of these tests? Well, in order to get a curve like this, we need to head out, and ideally, I would want you to be doing this outside rather than on a treadmill, because we get a better correlation to what is your real world thresholds rather than kind of a predictive model of how does a treadmill correlate to outside. So what I want you to do is go out and do 1200 meters or around 5 to 6 minutes. Obviously, it's going to depend on what kind of pace that you're running at. So by doing that, I want you to go on like a looped course. By doing a loop course, you minimize any variations in the terrain, the elevation, or the wind that could impact each stage. You want to be doing around 5 to 6 stages. Doing around 6 stages is going to give you enough of a buffer to do a nice 10-second stepwise approach. So if you look at something like mine, where it comes out at around 350 watts, 370, 380, 390, 400, 410, 420. And so that gives me a really nice stepwise graph that I can look at. So what you want to do is map out your speeds. So whether that's pace or power, and if you were doing, say, a 7-minute mile, then you would want to be looking at going to a 650 and then a 640. I don't really need to show you all of these, but it's going to make it a little bit easier to explain the next step. And so what we want is to have this third and fourth or fifth test to be right around marathon pace to 10K pace, thereabouts. So what we'd want to capture in here is probably half marathon pace. And from there, we can kind of see, where is the steps? So from here, you can see in mine, there's an initial step there where I'm going from, around 390 watts up to around 400. Let's have a look. So it would be this 384 to 390 is what's happened between the third and fourth one. And I know this test was actually done before a marathon, but my marathon was 385, 383, something like that watts. So that clearly shows there's a significant first step, which is going to be my lactate threshold 1, that aerobic threshold, where there's a first major contribution of anaerobic metabolism, because before that, I did not see an increase in lactate greater than 1 millimole. That's the concentration of lactate. It's how it's measured. That's a unit of measurement of concentration. And so from there, I'm still very much aerobic steady state. And it doesn't matter too much for you individually what these absolute numbers are. But you can see, so that was my first point where it then started to significantly step up. So in the initial test, it's better to underestimate your capabilities than overestimate them, because within this test at 6 5-minute stages, we have 30 minutes of work. Now, the first couple are going to be around kind of that zone 2, zone 3 threshold, that kind of steady intensity. So that's not too hard. But the next 20 minutes then, and especially this last one, which you can set a pace, but its end up is going to be all out. And what you'll find there is you're just extremely tired. And from this data, we can then find a point where we can test our maximal lactate steady state, which would be the next phase. But what I'm predicting is that from a stepwise approach like this, where you're doing, say, 10 seconds a mile in this instance, that you'd have a curve that's relatively similar to this one. And then you can map heart rate as well, and you can kind of line up your heart rates with these thresholds. However, there can be an underrepresentation of heart rate when you're only dealing with 5-minute stages, because as you know, it can take, especially when we're getting into more of a lactate threshold, heart rate can take a while to reach the O2 demand of the muscle. So there may be an underrepresentation of the heart rate reading. So then that leads us on to a maximal lactate steady state test, which we use from this data that we have. The data that we have is that somewhere around here for me, so if we're calling it 380 to 390 watts, somewhere around there is going to be my maximal lactate steady state. So I want to go and test that. What does that look like? A traditional maximal lactate steady state test is done almost exactly the same as my 30-minute test. So what you want to do is you do 30 minutes and then you take a lactate at the start. So we'll take lactate there, and then 10 minutes in, we will take lactate there, and then at 30 minutes, we will take another lactate reading. So that is a 20-minute gap in there. And the reason we do this is the start's really just a double check. 10 minutes is to get the first initial steady state reading. So that is first point of steady state. And then after 20 minutes, we want to ensure that we are still in a steady state. So this is like the double check of a steady state. Double check of steady state. And what we don't want to see is greater than 1 millimole of concentration increase in your lactate across whatever pace or power output you're doing. And you want it to be very steady. So whatever you're doing, you want to be able to hold and maintain. So whatever course you're choosing, whether it's an athletics track or it's just a loop around the block, you want to be able to maintain a very steady pace power output. And so that will allow you to maintain what would be, if I show you here, the first increase around here. So that initial lactate threshold 1 that you've identified, where it's the first increase beyond 1 millimole of increase in lactate. And what I'd be thinking is you're trying to do marathon pace or just slightly faster. So for me, I ended up, my marathon this year was 3:39 minutes per K. And so I was testing around a 3:35 was the point that I chose. So I chose the lower point rather than the higher point. That's kind of just knowing myself and my data a little bit. And so then what I'm doing is I'm just trying to run, in terms of a power output, say like it was like 375 watts for this entire duration. And then what I want to see is what was my lactate readings. And I don't have them up on the screen, but it was around 1.2, and then it was around a 2.3, and then I think it was like 2.7 here. So that was the 10 minutes, and that was the 30-minute mark there. And so that increase there was no more than 4 millimole. So it was less than 1 millimole. So from there, now I know that this is definitely a sustainable pace. I don't need to go back and recheck any of those zones. But this maximal lactate steady state test is very easily to implement, and it's essentially what I do throughout my marathon training. So you can do this over and over again, and within my marathon training, I will do something that looks like this within my effort. So I have a couple of test sessions. I have 5 by 5K, and I'll test after every one. So after every set or interval, then I'll test. And I'm looking for the same thing there. Where at any point in these 5 by 5Ks, so we're looking at 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, where is there a potential decoupling that shows that my rate of fatigue is such that my muscles are fatiguing and needing to engage a deeper muscle or motor unit that is not as aerobically fit? It's more anaerobically dependent. So what can that look like? Sometimes, say you've done these 3 5s and I've got like a 2.1, a 2.2, and then a 2.7. So there's an increase there, but it's relatively stable. It's in line. Then at 20K, you're seeing a 3.3. So now, just within that last 5K, we've had a 0.6 millimole increase. It could be an anomaly. We don't know. You're still feeling pretty good. We can then check heart rate against the pace and power to see if there's any decoupling. And so that's when heart rate begins to decouple away from a constant pace or power output. So when that happens, we know that there is a large contribution of fatigue and anaerobic metabolism and heat dissipation needing to be integrated into this equation, and it's essentially you're well beyond diminishing returns here. So we can see that that's happening. Then at 25, you're going to go one of two ways. There's going to be 3.3 again or around there, and you're like, okay, so I definitely need to work more back end fitness and capacity. Maybe I should slow down by 5 watts or say 5 seconds per K or per mile at the beginning to see, where am I in terms of my marathon capabilities. Or you'll find that it just shoots off and then you're at 5. Your heart rate may be more or less okay. Let's say we've got a 15 BPM increase from the first couple to the last one. That's not outrageous. But what we do know now is that 25K in, you have a significant contribution of anaerobic metabolism being integrated into your work equation. This is now the danger zone because you still have 17 kilometers to run, whatever that means for you, an hour 15 minutes, and you're rapidly using your glycogen stores. So this is just, it's a red flag, right? We need to be wary of this. The other thing you can do is 2 times 10K, or there's lots of ways you can skin it. We can do a pre-fatigue where we run for 2 hours, then we do 30 minutes at marathon pace power, and we can test here and we can test here. And really what we're trying to do is find that point where the decoupling happens. So if you're looking to run 3 hours or around that, and then at 2 hours we're testing and you've got your 3.0 or like a 2.1, whatever the number is. But over here, again, we're at the 5. You've done zone 2, and then you've done essentially marathon pace for 30 minutes. You've only done 2.5 hours and you're already at the risk point. What I'd want to see then is that this is nice and low and stable. Same with these 2x10. As we extend out our time at marathon pace, we still want to have really stable values. Okay, so that's marathon training. Half marathon training is more or less similar. We're just shortening the durations. So we just want to find that point where, let's say we're doing, say, a 3 times 3K or like 2 miles. And I'm looking, we don't want to find breakpoints really early on. Like this is 9K or say, yeah, pretty much 10K for in miles. And we're halfway through. We want to be testing here and finding a point that is somewhere around this kind of lactate threshold too. We don't want to be going over that at any point. So for me, it's somewhere around this 4.9 to 5.4. Let's call it 5. Within my half marathon that I built up for this year, I got like a 2-minute PB at a 1:12. Was that I was looking to stay under 5 for these 3x3K efforts. So I go stay under 5, knowing that from my maps data, that was definitely diminishing return. Like that was too hard. That was beyond my lactate threshold. So when I was doing these workouts, I knew the specificity of the stimulus I was trying to elicit. And so the pace or power output was irrelevant within training because I was just trying to hit the metabolic targets of being able to buffer high lactate concentrations at a point that was somewhat steady state. Because if I was to do, say, I will rub that out. If I was today do, say, 5x3K and I'm at 15K, by these last two, so if we're doing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, by this one, I can afford to be higher in my values because I've got, for me, it was, 6Ks left, around 20 minutes left, and I can play with fire a little bit there. But then if I'm purely looking to maximize the point, like the metabolic stimulus, then throughout these, I'm just trying to sit at that kind of 4 to 5 for me millimole. And so that's what I'd be doing in terms of monitoring my lactate testing. Then at some point you can go back and retest on something like this, like doing your stepwise test. But for the most part, once you've done your initial mapping out, and if you had, so I've done other ones in the past, and pretty much once you've got those 2 breakpoints, you'll find that as you keep training, your numbers will increase or decrease. And the absolute numbers is much like heart rate. The absolute numbers won't change much. So what that would look like for me, it's December now, and that was March that I did that test. I've done lots of lactate testing, but I haven't done the stepwise curve test. I know that pretty much for me that 2 to 3 millimole is going to sit around that aerobic threshold, and that anaerobic threshold is going to be that 4 to 5 number. And so whatever these end up being is just relative to whatever training I'm doing. So if I go out today and I do like that 3x3K, I'm only able to hit 350 watts. That's what that number is. Same with this number being 380, which was my marathon pace, and now it's my threshold pace because I've had some time off. That's just kind of what those numbers are. And in training, I can just keep testing. And from practically using a lactate meter, that's all you really need to know. You want to get that initial curve where you do those 5 minutes or 1200 meters or 1K, depends how fast you are. Stepwise approach, maybe because you're new, you'll need to do a couple of these to find and get a really good solid curve. So you might want to do them every 2 months or so. And once you have those data points, you pretty much are going to be stable with those, whatever it is for you, like 2 millimolar and 4 millimole, which is like the traditional kind of threshold 1 and 2 points. And then you just want to map out in your training, what is that looking like? Am I able to hold steady state? Where does the steady state break? When do I get to a point where I'm not necessarily above my traditional threshold in terms of my pace or power output, but I am in terms of fatigue along that duration. So when you are running an hour at your half marathon pace, you can test, right? And same when we start going down to like the athletics track and you're just looking for specific stimulus, then you need to know that you have lactate measures above 5, above 8 if you're doing a 5K and you're looking for lactate tolerance testing. So from that, I can pretty much just finish off by showing you best practices for actually using the lactate meter itself. And that would look something like this. So you have your lactate meter, and then you're going to have some strips. I actually don't have any strips available, but what you want to do is you want to get a finger prick first off. So you want to finger prick, or you can use the ear. It really doesn't make a massive amount of difference. You just need to keep it consistent. Most people are restricted in blood flow in their hands, and so the ear can be a bit easier. But if you're just doing a self-administration, the finger's going to be a lot easier. You want to wipe it with an alcohol wipe. First off, do you need to continuously do this? I mean, it is best practice, but if you're just out on your own, it's going to be a bit hard. So you want to wipe that away. Then you want to avoid squeezing it as much as possible. So you're going to put the finger prick in, which will draw out some blood. That initial one, you most definitely want to wipe away. Not with an alcohol wipe at that point, because the alcohol can get into the laceration, and so then you may get a contaminated sample. From that point, you want to avoid squeezing out the blood so you don't lyse any of the blood cells, and again, manipulate potentially or contaminate the reading. And when you put your strip in, you put your strip and then you just take the sample and leave it there. Hold some compression on the point of the laceration so that that stops the bleeding. And from there, you just wait and you should be pretty much good to go. In terms of timing, from what I've seen, the best case is that you are under 1 minute for your sampling, but you have up to, what would that be? Up to 3 minutes to take your sample before it starts to diminish. So if we had a look at a lactate concentration in the blood, you may get, so let's say this is the point that you stop. Depends on how hard you're going. If you're doing a 5K or say a 400 meter really intensive repeat, you'll get a little bit of an increase up to 2 minutes. And then from there, it'll begin to decline. And 3 minutes is that point where it's definitely beginning to decline. And sometimes what I've found is if you do get it really soon, you may get this like real big spike in lactate where you've got an increased blood flow, but muscle activation is just completely stopped because you're at rest. And then you might get like a 6 to 8 millimole when you're just running at marathon pace. So overall though, that's what you need to know in terms of using lactate meters. This is a bit of a new setup for me, so I hope you like it. That's everything. All right, post your questions in below and I'll link to that spreadsheet that I put together for you guys. So yeah, catch you on the next one.